Cycle Drag Universe, do I have a treat for you today? Kick those feet up and relax because we've got definitely one of my favorite motorcycles, maybe one of the most transformative and special bikes of all time, a bike that has certainly left an indelible mark on the motorcycle industry. I am talking about the incomparable 1973 Z1 900. Hello, everybody, from the Throttlestop in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. I'm Jack Rapella, joined with our resident expert, Mr. Brady Ingles from Retro Speed. Always good to see you, Brady. We've got a lot to talk about, a special feeling this motorcycle brings. But what is really special here is you and I, especially at Mecum, we've seen a lot of these bikes restored. We've seen record breakers, but I personally have never seen one all original with, are you ready for this? Less than 200 miles. Who has the discipline? Who has the foresight? I'm looking at the odometer right now. 193.7. Brady, when you see this machine as it rolled off the showroom floor many, many years ago, what's your first thought?
It's amazing to me that somebody would have the discipline to do this. Especially in '73 when this motorcycle came out. It was such a big deal that everybody wanted to ride it, wanted to tear up the streets, beat all the Honda 750s, show the two-stroke guys who was boss, and to be able to have that kind of discipline, to stow it away, and in such a wonderful environment. We see Z1s with lower miles, but never ones that have been preserved quite like this.
I agree. It's really educational for me, and I hope all of this shows up in the video because, like I said, we have seen so many at Mecum and elsewhere, and what we know now, that thanks to great companies like Z1, there's more available for this bike than there was in the early 70s because there's so many reproduction parts out there. And I'm even looking at this, and it's so educational to me because I'm seeing some differences vis-a-vis the just absolute flawless reproduction parts that we see, where I'm seeing even just some minor flaws from the factory, how the paint was just a little different in 1973. But I think that's what makes it so special is Kawasaki in the year 73, they weren't looking to put out mint gems. They were putting something out that you could go ride across the country.
Well, the definition of mint gems back then and what it is now today probably has changed ever so slightly. There is just enough patina on this motorcycle that makes it lovely and makes it, it's very believable to see the under 200 miles and for the age. Some of the decals show just a little bit of UV fade, and every once in a while in the clear, you can get just the smallest spider, and that's wonderful. Because if the paint and the decals were 100% absolutely perfect, you would know that it was restored and it wasn't an original. From the restoration world, what I do, when we concourse restore a motorcycle, the objective is to get it to look like this. We don't want it over-restored. We want it to look just like it left the factory. Yeah, awesome to see one. Really, really awesome to see one.
Yeah, it really is. It's like you and I were speaking moments ago that in the baseball card world, there's PSA. There's not really a PSA for the motorcycle world, and that's what makes it so special to try to verify the authenticity of this bike. And I'm with you to your point that you look at this bike and it clearly it wasn't. We're so used to seeing the Mike Konopacki record breaker from Mecum a few years ago that brought in $50,000. And as the very astute announcer John Craman told us, that bike was over restored. It was much shinier than it was in the year 1973. But this one, as you can tell, it's really a piece of history. And I have a question for everybody watching out there. I got a question for you too. I'm going to make you guess. I'm going to put you on the spot because it's just a guess. How many 73 Z1 900s are left with less than 200 miles?
Oh, I can't imagine there is any. If there is one, you would assume Kawasaki has a wonderful museum in Japan.
Probably.
I don't know.
Probably.
And I'm sure I would assume they would have a really nice one. With very low miles, maybe push miles only, but I don't know of it. And besides this one, I haven't seen one.
Well, if you made me guess, I'm going to say what I've found throughout my travels and my exploits. There's a lot of private collections out there that, because there's some I'm dying to see where Guys have said, hey, you want to come see my collection someday? Here's a photograph. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this isn't public. So I'm betting there's maybe a couple out there. I'm betting I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say there's maybe one or two of these still left in a crate. Maybe some dealer had the foresight, or maybe it got lost up in the attic.
Sure.
Who knows? But I think you and I are both in agreement that this is so incredibly rare. And from a collectability standpoint, the old cliche is it's only original once.
Yes.
And that's what makes it so valuable. So I'm just wondering, if the great Mike Konopacki got $50,000 with one that was primarily put together with reproduction parts, could we be looking at a world record breaker here if this were to roll across the lot at Mecum?
You know, I think this one definitely has the potential. Whether it's this year or in the years to come, I think it's a wonderful example that's only really going to increase in price. And to Mike's restoration, to that point about to over-restoring it, I understand how you get there. Because today's paint, today's chrome is a lot better than what was in the 70s. And it's a lot different than what was in the 70s. So, you know, when all the experts restore the Z1s, I understand where you can't dumb down the chrome and dumb down the paint. So I understand where they get there. And that bike was beautiful. And the marks that it sold for, very impressive. I think this one could take a real run at it, though. I do.
I think so, too. Okay, so again, if you put me on the spot, I'm going to say this one gets north of $75,000 because it's so special. And I'm going to say number two, we're never going to be able to find out because Jim Bellistreri of the Throttlestop loves this bike so much that he's never going to sell it. In fact, he's wild enough, and I love his attitude, he may take this thing for a ride around the block or two. You never know. There might be over 200 miles by the time he gets done.
You know, and he should too, because these were great motorcycles.
Yeah.
They were wonderful, and it would be just as happy to do it now as it was back then.
Yes. I'm looking at things too that like I've never really seen before. I've seen a lot of drag bikes, seen a lot of resto rods. I have a 77 KZ resto rod that you can tell there's been so many different hands on it and so many different owners over the years. You wish these things could talk throughout all the history. But I'm even looking like I've never seen the plastic clip right here on this hose tie that I imagine is right from Kawasaki. That how many guys kept that on their motorcycle, you know?
Yeah, and it was one of those things that the Japanese manufacturers did like to use those, but it was one of those things where you put them out in the sun, they would get hard and crack off right away. So it is really nice to see that. This bike didn't see much sun and was in a very, very dry environment.
Yes. Because
there's just no surface rust. And the Japanese bikes, their chroming wasn't the absolute best, and they would surface rust. So yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Well, that's what's cool is Jim didn't know all the history. He shouldn't know all the history on this thing. He said it did come from a very trusted, unimpeachable source that he's bought bikes off before. So the guy, I'm assuming this man knew what he was doing, tucked it away in a climate-controlled environment, and that's why it looks so good. Another thing that caught my attention, I don't know if you know much about, but these yellow markings. Is that from the factory? Is that when a dealership was putting the bike together? These yellow marks, I'm assuming for torque specifications. Is that what that was for?
Yeah, it was a checks and balances thing on the assembly line. If that nut and fastener got torqued to what Kawasaki wanted, it was painted. That way they knew they didn't leave anything loose. And the next person down the line also knew that they didn't have to take care of that. That part was done. And when things are loosened up, that's the first thing. That paint is cracked. To see it all in its original form, very rare, very rare.
Incredibly rare. What else stuck out to me is, when you ride these bikes, you pick up a lot of road grime when you put miles on them. So it's weird for me to see the base gasket is so prominent. And you can tell that's a stock base gasket because it's so thick. Up here, the valve cover gasket, so prominent. That's exactly how it would look from the factory. It's so clean. I just wonder if this bike was out in any type of dirty environment at all, because it sure doesn't look like it. And I know the Z1 had the black engine cases later when they would go to all aluminum. If you've ever dealt with the Z1, you know my plight here, that you get this sparkling clean up here, and if you ever got caught in the rain or in a nasty environment, this was the hardest part to keep clean.
Yeah, absolutely. The Z1, this black engine kind of changed the game, the styling game. Honda in effect, took that for their later ones when the Kawasaki's went back to the silver. But it was a wonderful covering on it, so you got away from the aluminum corrosion.
No doubt. I want to talk a little bit more about the history of this bike too, and I hope you guys are enjoying this. And if you know anything about this bike, if you've ever ridden one, please leave that information down below in the comments. But for those who may not know, let's take you back to the late 60s. So here's something I just found out through my research. I don't know if you know anything about, but it's very interesting because we talked about the Z2 and the rumors of why you couldn't sell a bike over 750 cc's at that time in Japan. I heard through my research that there was a gentleman's agreement between Kawasaki and Honda that 750 was the limit. And apparently when the CB came out, it was so groundbreaking and so popular, Kawasaki was about ready to come out with their 750. And that's when they said, no, we got to take a step back and we got to one-up these guys. And that is when this project was dubbed the New York Steak, because they believed the best thing you could get on the menu in America was the steak. And this would be the best motorcycle that you could buy. So they waited. It really, the CB from the late 60s to when this started surfacing around 72, that was a good chunk of time where Kawasaki really took a step back, took things to the next level with the DOHC, the double overhead cam that we see. And that's why many say the CB created the sport bike. And if that is true, this created the muscle bike and took it to a whole nother level.
Oh, absolutely. And thank goodness Kawasaki did pull back a little bit. Yeah, that bike was supposed to be 750 cc's and debuting in 1970. Honda came out with the CB750. They showed it off in 69, and Kawasaki pulled back and did a complete redesign of it. Because the 750 they were planning on producing wasn't that Z2 that we talked about in the past. It was a completely different motorcycle. And Kawasaki had to live on their two-strokes for a couple of years.
That's right.
And their two-strokes got them through that gap.
Two-strokes were great.
And the gap was great because they came out with this motorcycle. The dual overhead cam was a huge thing. And honestly, the crankshaft configuration, that was the next 30 years of inline-four motorcycles were based off of this engine. And when this came out in 73, honestly, it did everything better than the Honda. It really did. The Honda still sold pretty well, but this motorcycle was just faster. It was more reliable. It did everything better. They were incredibly reliable motorcycles. If you would keep up on points and condenser, keep a fresh air filter in it, and do oil changes, it is nothing for these motorcycles to do 100,000 miles and not have to go into them. They were very reliable. The build of the engine had surpassed the 750cc. If Kawasaki would have brought this out in their 750cc format in 1970, I feel like at that time it would have gotten a little forgotten about compared to the Honda. But they brought out this, we're still talking about it today.
Still talking about it, and it brings a tear to my eye as you talked about how this engine is still around and set the standard. This really became the small block Chevy for drag racing.
Sure.
So many motorcycle drag racers and hot rodders back then tore these things apart. I'm sure a lot of you out there are crying, maybe a little tear in your beer, because my dad was one of the guys that, what was the first thing that you would do? You would take this exhaust system off immediately. Most of them hung on the garage for several years till you bumped your head enough and said, that's it, I'm throwing it away. Well, now original exhaust is one of the most valuable things. A lot of guys would get rid of this air box as well and go to the individual pods. And you put a pipe on this thing, you jetted it. From the factory, it was an 80 horsepower motorcycle. It was just unbelievable at that time. It could eclipse 130 miles an hour. And I guess what's tough for me to realize, because I wasn't thought of in the 70s. I wasn't there. I don't know when you were thought of. I wasn't there just yet. But I'm so used to four strokes being the norm that, as you alluded to, it was a two-stroke world. And we love two strokes. They're fast. They're snappy. We know that there's some comfort and reliability issues with those, to where when this thing came out, this was a refined piece that you could jump on and ride coast to coast. This was the game changer.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, thank goodness Kawasaki had their two strokes, and their two strokes were amazing. But even Kawasaki knew internally that wasn't the future of touring. And when this came out, you read about these stories, how they were trying to hide it and they needed to test it. And they would go from California to Florida with Honda decals on them just to hide them. Fun stories, but to prove its durability. And they proved it on the racetrack. They proved it on these secret tests. But what's also proved it is the last 40 years of us enjoying these motorcycles.
It's sensational. I'd love to have one. I have, a 77 KZ1000 with some modifications. It's a resto rod. And I can tell you this, I enjoy riding that bike more than I enjoy riding a modern sport bike. Now, for reliability, you can't touch the modern fuel injection and all the goodies and the safety and everything that comes along with that. But just in terms of taking a putt, I take my KZ every single time over my Hayabusa if I'm just going on a short distance, because they're just such comfortable bikes. And then too, talking about how ahead of the game Kawasaki was on fit and finish. If you just look at this bike, right? You got the teardrop tank that is just so legendary and iconic. Ducktail rear end, this cool circular tail light. It was such a good looking motorcycle.
Oh yeah, it was a little bit, took a bit more risk than Honda did. And that's not too much of a surprise. Even with a front fender that doesn't have the support struts, Honda would go the conservative way. Kawasaki went to, a bit more aggressive with the styling. And thank goodness they did. It's interesting too with the internal engine, the crankshafts on them were built up of pieces and pressed together, so they're roller-bearing cranks. Not something that's done anymore with four-strokes, but you can almost see Kawasaki looking back at their two-stroke ideas for this. Did that pressed together, built-up crank work great for the 900s? It absolutely did, but unheard of today. Neat to see.
It's interesting, too, from a collectability standpoint. What we're seeing is this is the one everybody wants. In 1976, they went to the KZ900, a few modifications, not many. 77 began the era of the KZ1000, and I'm sure you would agree with what we're seeing in Mecum. There's not much collectability in those years. It's amazing how cheap. I was talking with John Craman, and he says, if you want one of these bikes to ride, go get yourself a 78, 79 KZ1000. You can still have that bike at a pretty decent price compared to the collector item that we're looking at here.
There's a ton of value in the KZ1000, absolutely. The first year 900, that's always going to be king. The Z2, super rare, but there's a couple of years you can get away with that. It's not just only the first year with the Z2. It's just kind of looked at as an early blanket. But the first year of the Z1, the prices compared to the 1000, to be honest, the 1000 can do everything that the 900 can and are a great bargain if you want to pound some miles on it.
No doubt about it. So looking at this bike, Brady, the only thing we found that is not original, tires. Did they lose? You know the collector market better than me. Do you lose? How many points do you lose for not having original tires?
Well, it's one of those tough things. The inner tubes would never make it from 1973. So if you're taking the bike apart, you're putting on new inner tubes. It's often thought of to put on some fresh tires, something safe for when you do want to ride it. They went with a really nice period tread. These Continentals were really good for the 70s motorcycles. And at the same time, you don't know all the backstory. What if this didn't accumulate any miles until 1980? And the owner at that point thought, no, I'm going to ride this motorcycle. This is what motorcycles are for. I'm going to use it. Put some new tires and tubes on it. I'm going to ride it. And then 100 miles into that ride, he's like, this is such a gem. I got to stop. So I know some people will really get wound up about the original tires, and I understand why they like that. However, I don't know if anybody really fawns over a motorcycle tire with tires that don't hold air and the tires are dry rotted. It's okay to put fresh rubber on them.
Boy, you nailed it. And that's why I love this and I love bench racing and just talking about bikes, because you're right. You wish these things could talk, that they have a story. That 100% could be the case. You could see a situation where somebody found one in a crate, and then, like you said, in 1997, they decide they're going to relive their youth and take it for a ride until somebody says, hey, what are you doing? Keep this thing low miles. There's a million things that could have happened here, but I got to say, I have never seen one this original. It's really a piece of history. It's amazing for posterity. Jim says he's going to take it for take it for a lap. So I'm not going to argue with Jim, but you may just see him if you come up here to Elkhart Lake taking a lap or two. But gosh, gorgeous bike, Brady. Anything else you would like to add based on your experience working on these things, restoring these things? I know you have done so much.
Yeah, it's really just nice to be in the company of it. I could look at this motorcycle for hours because, like I said, because we do a lot of restorations and take them all back to exactly how they left the factory. This is always our goal. This is exactly what we want. And to be in the presence of it and just see all the small details, it's really educational. Everything I do in life is ultimately around motorcycles. And this is always what we're trying to achieve. We've all seen Z1s with a lot of patina. And we've all seen fully restored Z1s. But this is unseen. If you're in the area, you got to come up and check this thing out.
There's
awesome to see.
So many amazing bikes here, and this one is my favorite. I told Jim, he got it off the rack. I didn't think it was ever coming down off the rack, so I really appreciate him doing that. That's the rule here, too. If it's up on the rack, that means it's not for sale. There's a lot of stuff for sale on the ground, but if it's up on the rack, it is not for sale. If you're going to come in with this one, you better come in with a massive check, and I don't even know if Jim would accept that. But yeah, to me, just a very, very, very special bike. My father, this was his era. He had a 76 KZ900. He gave me the sickness when he rode to the hospital when I was born. He says he parked that bike right outside. Nobody at the hospital was happy about that, but that was the first time he ever saw me, and I've loved this bike ever since. And I just feel like, too, that this motorcycle was a footnote in history. It transcended the early 70s, and I think it really paved the way for what did we see next. We saw some crazy stuff. I mean, here comes the GS. And then in the era of excess, we saw Honda try to mess around with the CBX, the six-cylinder bike. And then eventually, what would this give birth to? I feel like this paved the way for the Ninja.
Yeah,
absolutely. Which we still see going strong today. The Hayabusa, I feel like, owes a debt of gratitude to the Z1 that really kicked this off and then started that battle between the KZ and the GS that we would see later. So, like I said, I consider it in drag racing. It's like our small block Chevy. It's a beautiful bike. Probably a lot of drag racers right now maybe watching this, checking their frame to see if they got an early number. So that was something that was going on too. Imagine if you had an early number Z1 and you made it. Guys would put a double clubfoot swing arm, conversion chassis on it. As Mike Konopacki told me, famous drag racer and restorer, you check the numbers up here. If you got a matching number that corresponds to the engine, not that the numbers would match, they don't match specifically like a car would, but if you can verify that it's from the same bike, just about everything else you can get reproduction.
Yeah. I'm sure there was in 73 because it was the horsepower king, because it was beating everything. I'm sure a lot of them were taken apart. Only makes this one more special. If this one ever does go for sale, I'm sure there's going to be some stories.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Well, Brady, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Always fun to talk motorcycles with you. Guys, fun to talk motorcycles with you, too. Let us know your thoughts, your stories down below. It is a legend, and you can see it in person right here at the Throttlestop. If you're wondering exactly where we're at, look up the racetrack, Road America. We're right down the road from that awesome place here in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, the Throttlestop. Thank you, guys, so much for watching. Much more content coming. And if there's anything, fast motorcycles or Z1, we're in. From the Throttlestop, Cycle Drag rolls on.